The Second World War did not end with a single unifying act of surrender. It dissolved instead into a million personal moments of terror, relief, and choice. As the German war machine ground to a halt in the spring of 1945, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht found themselves caught between two closing jaws: the American and British forces pressing from the west, and the unstoppable, avenging tide of the Soviet Red Army in the east. Their final choice, a choice often made by individual soldiers, companies, and entire armies, was between two fundamentally different realities of defeat. It was a choice that would determine not just their own survival, but the very fate of their families and the future of Germany. Imagine the scene through the eyes of Oberleutnant Karl Heisler. The date is April 18, 1945. The location is the Ruhr Pocket, a colossal, desperate trap that has just swallowed over 325,000 German soldiers, the largest mass surrender of the Western Front. Heisler steps out of a battered farmhouse, hands raised, the white surrender flag a torn piece of shirt tied to a broomstick. He is met not by bayonets or screaming rage, but by the cool, almost bored professionalism of a U.S. Army lieutenant from the 104th Infantry Division. The American, chewing gum, pulls a standardized, multilingual surrender agreement from a clipboard. The first thing the lieutenant asks is not about loyalty to the Führer, but simply, do you understand the terms of the Geneva Convention? A fully expanded narrative would detail the processing, the issuance of K-rations, and the quick, dispassionate transfer to a prisoner camp. Heisler's memory of that first day of captivity was not of humiliation, but of a quiet, shocking order. They were prisoners, yes, their war was over, but they were human beings under an established legal framework. This was the first reality of defeat: adherence to the law. Contrast this sharply with another scene happening at the same time on the other side of the collapsing Reich. The date is January 25, 1945, on the Polish-German frontier, where the Vistula-Oder offensive has shattered the German front. Private Heinz Schutt, a 16-year-old conscript, is huddled in a ditch when his position is overrun. Suddenly, the silence is broken by the sound of tanks, followed by a wave of Soviet infantry. When they are overwhelmed, the Soviet soldiers, many of whom are survivors of the sieges of Stalingrad and Leningrad, show no interest in clipboards or international law. A Soviet sergeant major spots the insignia of Schutt's unit. He doesn't read a proclamation. He screams an accusation in Russian. "You burned our villages. You killed my mother." Schutt witnesses two of his comrades, slightly wounded, being pulled from the line and executed summarily. There is no processing, no talk of conventions, only the stark reality of the great patriotic war. A war of blood, suffering, and deep-seated righteous retribution. This was the second reality of defeat: vengeance. These two moments, happening at the same time in the same war, were not accidents. They were the unavoidable results of two completely different philosophies of war and human value. The Wehrmacht's final, desperate flight was not just a tactical withdrawal, it was a psychological migration, a mass movement toward one reality and away from the other. This is the story of American kindness, a professionalism rooted in logistics, law, and liberal principles, versus Soviet vengeance, a brutality forged in years of unparalleled suffering and the ideological demand for retribution. This is the story of the German army's final choice, and how that choice defined the fate of millions and the contours of post-war Europe.
The difference in how the American GI and the Soviet Red Army soldier treated a captured German was not random. It was a difference meticulously cultivated by propaganda, deeply rooted in national ideology, and ultimately codified by military doctrine. To understand the final choice made by the Wehrmacht in 1945, we must first understand the philosophical DNA of the duel. The American and British approach to the German soldier was defined by two central pillars: the Geneva Convention and pragmatic logistics. For the Western Allies, the 1929 Geneva Convention was not merely a diplomatic nicety, it was a core component of military discipline and strategic doctrine. This adherence stemmed from a deeply ingrained cultural and legal tradition, the belief that warfare, even against an ideological enemy, must adhere to a set of civilized rules. This wasn't about moral superiority, it was about maintaining the professionalism of a volunteer democratic army. The U.S. Army specifically trained its personnel in the conduct of processing prisoners, classifying the German POW as a legal entity with defined rights. This was disseminated not just for humane reasons, but for pragmatic ones. It was insurance for their own troops held in German camps, and it was a powerful propaganda asset to encourage more German surrenders. Strategically, the Western Allies viewed the defeated German soldier as a logistical problem to be solved, not a moral object to be punished. The doctrine was clear. The war against the German state is total, but the war against the German soldier ends the moment he raises his hands. The Soviet reality was fundamentally different. The Red Army's philosophy was forged in the fire of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion that cost the Soviet Union an estimated 27 million lives. Every captured German soldier was seen not as a prisoner, but as a direct instrument of the crimes committed on Soviet soil. The Soviet Union notably refused to ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention. This legal gap was filled by the ideology of the Great Patriotic War. The guiding principle was retribution. Soviet propaganda, driven by writers like Ilya Ehrenberg, was brutal and effective, turning the German soldier into a subhuman invader. Furthermore, the Soviet state had an immense, crushing need for reconstruction. Captured personnel were viewed as an economic asset, state property to be harnessed for the Gulag labor system. Discipline on the Eastern Front often yielded to the raw visceral need for revenge, especially among frontline units witnessing German atrocities firsthand. The Soviet doctrine was, the war against the German state is total, and the war against the German soldier continues until the debt of blood is paid. The single greatest point of divergence was geographic and psychological, the experience of invasion and atrocity. The Western Allies fought a war on foreign soil, seeing the effects of German power, but not the deepest, most systemic levels of German brutality against their own civilian populations. The Soviet soldier, conversely, was fighting to liberate his own country, one ravaged by genocide, mass executions, and the calculated starvation of cities. The discovery of sites like Majdanek and the countless mass graves hardened the Soviet attitude beyond the reach of any international convention. This divergence created the two realities in 1945. In the West, surrender meant entry into a system of law and logistics. In the East, it meant entry into a system of retribution and forced labor. The German soldier was the ultimate recipient of the ideological contrast.
The psychological and strategic duel between American law and Soviet vengeance was fought not in tanks and planes, but in the minds of the retreating German army.
This act is the deep dive, detailing how the two philosophical approaches translated into tangible life-or-death realities for the defeated Wehrmacht. The comparison begins with the piece of paper that defined a man's future, his official legal status upon capture. The Western Allies operated under the framework of the Geneva Convention, immediately categorizing captured enemy soldiers as prisoners of war. This was an immediate guarantee of rights. The Geneva Convention stipulated the right to a daily food ration equivalent to that of the detaining power's own reserve troops, protection from violence, the right to elect a representative, and, critically, access to the International Red Cross. The U.S. Army went to extraordinary lengths to adhere to this, setting up vast processing centers which, by war's end, were handling thousands of men per day. However, as the war concluded and the number of surrendering troops swelled into the millions, the U.S. Army created a critical, temporary classification, Disarmed Enemy Forces, DEF. This designation legally circumvented the full requirements of the Geneva Convention, primarily on the grounds of overwhelming numbers and lack of immediate infrastructure. While this policy led to some of the notorious hardships in the Rheinwiesenlager camps, where conditions were harsh and mortality figures rose due to rapid processing and lack of permanent shelter, the fundamental policy was still systematic, temporary, and predicated on an eventual return to the convention standards and, crucially, a rapid, orderly demobilization. The German army knew that surrendering to the West meant at worst temporary hardship, but ultimately a ticket home. The Soviet policy, in stark contrast, was governed by internal state directives that viewed the German-captured soldier as a repatriated resource for the state's massive reconstruction effort. The official policy was the immediate establishment of the Główne Uправление Podziałem Wojenno-Plannych I Internierobony, the Central Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees. This system was interwoven with the infamous Gulag Archipelago. Upon capture, the standard Soviet procedure was a brutal, immediate screening process often conducted by NKVD or SMARS detachments operating just behind the front lines. This screening sought to separate fanatical Nazis, SS members, and perceived war criminals from ordinary soldiers. In practice, this process was swift, summary, and often arbitrary, with political officers having the ultimate, unappealable say. Once screened, the German was categorized not as a POW with rights, but as a foreign internee destined for forced labor. The official policy dictated that the German was to be used as free labor for the state, often in Siberia or the harsh, devastated western regions. This system had no internal or external mechanism to enforce humane treatment. Survival was purely a matter of physical resilience, the camp commander's temperament, and sheer luck, often with a low caloric intake that led to widespread disease, starvation, and a shocking mortality rate. For the German soldier, capture by the Red Army meant potentially a decade of forced labor in conditions barely suitable for life.
These policies were not theoretical. They were the daily reality. Diaries from German soldiers surrendering in the West consistently reflect a psychological shift from terror to relief, and often a cautious optimism. One letter from Gefreiter Wilhelm Kruger to his sister, dated April 14, 1945, near Kassel, reads, "I saw the surrender leaflets. The promise of the Americans' printed word, you will receive food and medical care. I had not believed it, but when the tanks stopped, the American lieutenant merely pointed to the Red Cross flag on the jeep. We are POWs, we are safe, the terror is gone, we will live." Another diary entry, from a camp near Cherbourg on May 3rd, noted, "The days are long and monotonous. The food is tinned, beans and corned beef, not enough, but regular. The guards are strict, but fair. No beatings. They adhere to the letter of the law. I hear the news. We are to be used for clearing mines. Hard work, but it is work. We are not forgotten. The expectation of the German soldier surrendering west was survival and eventual repatriation. The Americans provided a predictable, if uncomfortable, future. However, letters and diaries from the Eastern Front tell a story of unmitigated dread, a terror so profound it often motivated suicidal charges rather than surrender. A final letter from Lieutenant Otto Kunst, dated January 19, 1945, near the Oderstellung, stated, "We have only 4 shells left. The Russians are behind us. Every man knows what it means to be captured. Better to die here by my own hand than be marched back to Siberia. My only thought is to put a bullet through myself before the Cossacks arrive." This profound fear was fueled by direct experience. An excerpt from a diary smuggled out of a Soviet camp in 1947 read, "2 winters since the war ended. My leg will not heal. They call us Fritz, a number, a thing. I saw Private Mueller collapse during the mine work today. They simply left him. The Soviet guard said, 'If you cannot work, you cannot eat. We have 27 reasons to let you starve.'" The expectation of the German soldiers surrendering east was death or years of torturous, slow attrition. This absolute psychological certainty became a critical factor in the final strategic movements of the German army. The psychological realities of capture were not simply humanitarian concerns. They were active strategic assets or liabilities in the final days of the war. The predictability and adherence to the law by the Western Allies were a powerful, war-winning strategic asset. The knowledge that surrender to the Americans meant relative safety and eventual release was a motivational weapon against the German fighting will. The most dramatic example was the Ruhr Pocket surrender, where over 325,000 German soldiers voluntarily walked into American custody. This willingness to surrender allowed the Allies to quickly neutralize vast swaths of German territory with relatively low casualty figures. The systematic processing of POWs, the quick removal from the battlefield, allowed American and British forces to transition rapidly from combat to military occupation, establishing order and beginning the slow process of denazification in an organized fashion. The American kindness was a form of efficient warfare. The Soviet policy of vengeance, on the other hand, created a strategic paradox. The terror of Soviet capture often stiffened German resistance. Units protecting the Reich capital, particularly the Volkssturm, and units defending the corridors to the west fought with fanatical desperation. Commanders like General Theodor Bussa, commanding the Ninth Army, expended tremendous effort not to fight the Soviets, but to pivot and fight through the Soviets to reach the Americans. This prolonged battles, like the Battle of Halba, a colossal breakout attempt by the Ninth Army, costing thousands of lives on both sides and delaying the final collapse of Berlin. While it slowed surrender, the vengeance factor was a powerful morale booster for the Red Army soldier. It provided an unimpeachable moral justification for the immense sacrifices they were making. This absolute certainty in their righteous cause fueled their relentless advance and their Einsatz, commitment, to the final bloody victory. The brutality guaranteed that the war would not end until absolute physical and political terms were met.
The duel between law and vengeance was not merely a humanitarian or ethical question. It was a matter of strategic consequence. The policies enacted by the U.S. and the USSR in the spring of 1945 left indelible marks on the final military outcome, the long-term fate of the captured, and the historical data defining the cost of defeat.
The most immediate and profound consequence of the dueling realities was the Great German Migration, a strategic and civilian phenomenon unprecedented in the final phase of a war. Entire armies and millions of civilians threw themselves westward, creating a colossal, spontaneous strategic priority for the collapsing Wehrmacht. The German High Command understood the stakes. Units were ordered to expend their last remaining fuel and resources not on defending Berlin from the east, but on fighting out to the west. The final operation approved by Hitler, the activation of General Wenck's 12th Army, failed to relieve Berlin, but Wenck quickly pivoted. Ignoring Hitler's orders, he turned his army's operational focus entirely toward creating a corridor to evacuate as many soldiers and civilians as possible across the Elbe River to American lines. Wenck was fighting the Red Army to deliver Germans to the Americans, effectively using the last remnants of the Wehrmacht as a logistical escort service for a mass surrender. This was the ultimate vote of no confidence in the Soviet reality. The contrasting policies of kindness and vengeance did not end with the cessation of hostilities. They defined the lasting trauma and the post-war political landscape. The vast majority of German soldiers captured by the Western Allies were repatriated to a rebuilding Germany within a relatively short period. While some were detained longer for denazification screening and others were transferred to French custody, by 1948, the vast majority had returned home. This facilitated a quicker psychological and economic recovery for West Germany. The American approach, while rooted in practicality, led to a more stable, integrated, and less politically radicalized post-war population. For those captured by the Soviet Union, the journey was an odyssey of suffering. The Gupffi camps continued to operate well into the post-war decade. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and grueling forced labor. The last German POWs were not returned to Germany until 1956, a full 11 years after the war's end, following direct diplomatic intervention. Their return often involved a slow re-education and rehabilitation process, creating a population deeply scarred and often politically suppressed in the newly formed East Germany. The Soviet policy left a generation of Germans missing, contributing to the deep, irreconcilable psychological schism that defined the Cold War division between East and West Germany. The final undeniable verdict rests on the hard statistics of the survival rates of German prisoners of war under the two systems. These numbers speak directly to the strategic and ethical consequences of the dueling realities. The disparity in mortality rates is the final chilling verdict. Even taking the most conservative Soviet figures, a German soldier was statistically over 10 times more likely to die in Soviet captivity than in Western Allied custody. The official Soviet death toll in captivity stands around 450,000 to 580,000 men out of 3.1 million captured, a mortality rate of 14 to 18%. This contrasts sharply with the Western Allied death toll of approximately 45,000 to 50,000 captives out of roughly 4 million, a mortality rate of only 1.1 to 1.3%. The fate of the 91,000 survivors of the Battle of Stalingrad is the most potent micro-data point. Of those who surrendered, only approximately 6,000 ever returned to Germany. This 93% death rate was the gruesome legend that propelled the final migration westward. The numbers confirm the German soldiers' choice. American kindness was a statistical guarantee of life. Soviet vengeance was a statistical sentence of probable death.
The story of the German army's final choice is not simply a footnote on the logistics of surrender. It is a profound revelation about the nature of total war and the strategic power of restraint. The comparison between American kindness and Soviet vengeance reveals a deeper truth about the clash of ideologies. Law is a weapon, and vengeance is a boomerang. The Western Allies, by adhering to the dry, bureaucratic stipulations of the Geneva Convention, inadvertently utilized an immensely powerful, war-ending psychological weapon. Their adherence to the rule of law was not merely a moral virtue, it was a strategic force multiplier. It undermined the Nazi propaganda machine's fight to the last breath narrative. It provided a clear, safe escape route for men who were already morally and physically broken. The Allied policy accelerated the internal disintegration of the Wehrmacht and facilitated the end of organized resistance with unparalleled efficiency. The U.S. won the final battle against the German army, not just with tanks and air power, but with the promise of due process. The Soviet approach, while understandable, even justified by the scale of the atrocities committed on their soil, ultimately cost them strategic advantage in the short term and enormous moral and diplomatic standing in the long term. The Soviet Union sacrificed the efficiency of a quick, large-scale surrender for the psychological satisfaction of retribution. This forced thousands of German soldiers to fight longer, harder, and more desperately, arguably prolonging the final stage of the war. More importantly, it enshrined the collective trauma that cemented the psychological separation of the two Germanys for the entire Cold War era. Vengeance, once released, cannot be easily controlled, and its long-term cost is always measured in human lives and political stability. The choice faced by the German soldier in 1945 stands as a testament to the enduring power of ideology. It shows that in the face of absolute collapse, human beings will seek the system that grants them the greatest possible predictability and humanity. The true measure of a military force is not only its ability to destroy, but its capacity for restraint in victory. The choices made by nations and their soldiers have consequences that echo through history. The duel between American law and Soviet vengeance created the psychological landscape of the Cold War and determined the personal fate of millions. If you want to continue exploring these critical comparisons, subscribe to WW2 Explained and let us know in the comments which historical duel we should examine next.